The transport ship descended through the orange atmosphere of Carvex Prime, carrying the last member of the research expedition to join the team already on the surface, the Arcera. Chun watched through the viewport as the landing site came into view. A collection of gleaming domes and crystalline structures scattered across the rust-colored desert like jewels thrown onto sand. The Vrexian scientists had erected their standard atmospheric habitats impressive. Transparent domes that rose 30 meters high, capable of housing dozens of researchers in climate-controlled comfort. The Cathari had deployed their signature crystalline shelters, elegant geometric structures that seemed to grow from the ground itself, their faceted walls catching the alien sunlight and scattering it into rainbow patterns. Chun's cargo hold contained something entirely different. As the ship landed and the cargo ramp lowered, the human began unloading crates of materials that drew curious stares from the assembled researchers. Commander Dexlar, the expedition leader, an Vrexian of considerable reputation, approached with his characteristic confident stride. His scales shimmered in the harsh light as he examined the human supplies with barely concealed confusion. Dr. Chen, welcome to Carvex Prime, Dexler said, his translator rendering his hissing speech into flat standard galactic. I see you've brought construction materials, but I assure you our habitation facilities are more than adequate for the entire team. Chun smiled politely as she directed the cargo drones to unload reinforced panels, digging equipment, and what appeared to be salvaged ship plating. I appreciate that, Commander, she replied, but I prefer to build my own accommodations. The Vrexian's head crest rose slightly in amusement. How charmingly primitive, he remarked before walking away to greet other members of the expedition. Over the following days, Chun began her construction project while the rest of the team focused on their scientific work. She selected a location about 200 meters from the main research cluster, near a slight rise in the desert floor. Then she started digging. The other researchers noticed, of course, Duravel Shore, a Cathari meteorologist whose crystalline body refracted light in mesmerizing patterns, often paused during atmospheric surveys to watch the human work. What is she doing? Velshore asked their colleagues during a meal break in the communal dome. Digging a hole, apparently, replied one of the Vrexian geologists with a dismissive wave. Humans have strange notions about shelter. Perhaps it's a cultural practice, suggested another researcher. A Delthani xenobiologist. We should be respectful. Respectful. Yes, Dexler interjected, but we needn't pretend to understand it. Chun worked alone most days, operating excavation equipment during the cooler morning hours and doing manual labor in the afternoon. She dug down nearly 4 meters, creating a rectangular pit roughly 15 meters by 20 meters. The native stone was dense but workable, and she used cutting tools to carve the walls smooth. When other researchers asked what she was building, she gave the same simple answer: insurance. The word meant little to beings who relied on advanced technology and engineering specifications. By the end of the second week, Chun's construction began taking recognizable shapes. She had lined the pit with salvaged hull plating, creating walls that could withstand significant pressure. She installed support beams made from local stone mixed with a bonding agent she'd synthesized from the planet's mineral deposits. The structure was crude by galactic standards, but undeniably solid. It looks like a bunker, observed one of the younger Vrexian scientists during a site visit. Something our ancestors might have built during the resource wars. Chun nodded as she welded another support beam into place. Bunkers work, she said simply. They've worked for thousands of years across hundreds of worlds. But surely our modern habitats are superior? The young scientist pressed. They're climate-controlled, radiation-shielded, and rated for extreme conditions. The human paused her work and looked up at the scientist. "What category of storm are they rated for?" she asked. "Category 4 minimum." The scientist replied proudly, "The domes can withstand winds up to 400 kilometers per hour and maintain integrity in temperature ranges from -80 to +70 degrees. Chun returned to her welding. "Good to know," she said, her tone unreadable as the third week progressed. The bunker developed additional features that puzzled observers. Chen installed multiple airlocks instead of a single entrance. She built what appeared to be redundant air filtration systems. She spent an entire day just sealing gaps with industrial-grade sealant. "She's obsessed with keeping things out," Velshore observed to Dexler during an evening meal. "Or keeping things in," the commander replied. "Either way, it seems excessive." The human joined them for meals occasionally, participating in discussions about the expedition's findings, but revealing little about her own project. The team had discovered fascinating magnetic anomalies beneath the surface, suggesting ancient technological remnants or unusual mineral formations. They'd cataloged 17 new species of silicon-based microorganisms, mapped underground water reserves that could support future colonization. Chun listened to all of this with interest, occasionally asking questions that revealed a sharp scientific mind, but when asked about her bunker, she remained vague. "Almost finished," she would say. "Just need to complete the environmental systems by the end of the 4th week." Chen's shelter was complete from the surface. It was barely visible, just a low stone structure that blended with the landscape, with a single heavy hatch set into the ground at an angle underground. It contained multiple chambers, a main living area, storage rooms, what appeared to be a small hydroponic garden under artificial lights, and enough space to accommodate perhaps 20 people in emergency conditions. The other researchers largely stopped paying attention. The novelty of watching the human dig had worn off, and their own work demanded focus. Dexler filed a note in his expedition log about cultural accommodation for a human team member, and moved on. Chun seemed content with this arrangement. She spent her days conducting geological surveys, contributing to the team's research, and maintaining her bunker. She installed sensors around the perimeter, connected to monitoring systems inside. She stockpiled supplies, water, food rations, medical equipment, tools. She tested and retested every seal, every airlock, every backup system. To the casual observer, it seemed like paranoia. To Sarah Chun, it was simply being prepared. The human had studied Carvex Prime's records before arriving. Sparse as they were, the planet had been surveyed only briefly. Deemed scientifically interesting but economically unviable, no permanent settlements existed here. Just occasional research expeditions like their own. The geological records showed something that bothered Chun. Though she hadn't shared her concerns with the team, the western hemisphere of the planet was scoured almost completely smooth, eroded down to bedrock across thousands of square kilometers. The eastern hemisphere, where they'd established their base, showed similar patterns but less severe. Something had abraded this world with incredible force, something periodic, based on the sediment layers she'd analyzed, but the records were incomplete, and her warnings would sound like speculations. So instead of arguing, she'd built her insurance 6 weeks into the expedition. Life had settled into a comfortable routine. The scientists worked on their projects, shared meals, discussed findings, and slept soundly in their comfortable habitats. Sarah Chun worked on her projects, shared occasional meals, and slept in her bunker. No one thought much about the humans' odd shelter. Anymore, it had become just another quirk of the expedition. Like the Catharis meditation rituals or the Vrexians' formal hierarchy, a harmless eccentricity from a species known for its peculiarities that was about to change. Velshore noticed the first anomaly during a routine atmospheric analysis on a Tuesday morning, though the Cathari meteorologist didn't. Recognize it as a warning at first. The pressure readings had fluctuated wildly for approximately 3 minutes before returning to normal levels. Val Shore recorded the data and flagged it for review, assuming it was an instrumental error. By Wednesday afternoon, the instruments were reporting consistent abnormalities. The atmospheric pressure was oscillating in patterns that made no meteorological sense, rising and falling in waves that suggested something massive was disturbing the air currents somewhere on the planet. Velshire brought the readings to Commander Vexler's attention during the evening briefing. I believe we're detecting some form of atmospheric disturbance, the Cathari explained, projecting the data onto the communal dome's main display. The pattern suggests a large weather system, though I cannot determine its exact location or magnitude from these readings alone. Vexler studied the graphs with mild interest. Should we be concerned? He asked. Our habitats are rated for severe weather events. At this point, I recommend monitoring the situation. Velshore replied, I've requested updated satellite data to give us a clearer picture. The seismic sensors began registering unusual activity on Thursday, not earthquakes exactly, but a low-frequency trembling that the Vrexian geologists initially attributed to underground water movement or tectonic settling. However, the pattern was too regular, too rhythmic to be natural geological processes. It's almost like a drumbeat, observed one of the geologists. Something very large, very far away, striking the ground repeatedly. The senior scientists gathered in the main dome on Friday morning to discuss the converging data. The expedition's orbital satellites had finally transmitted updated atmospheric imagery, and what they showed made even the confident Vexler pause on the far side of Carvex Prime. A storm system was forming, not forming. Actually, it had already formed and was growing with terrifying speed. The cloud formation stretched across a quarter of the planet's circumference, a vast spiral of churning dust and wind that was moving eastward at nearly 200 kilometers per hour. Category 5 at minimum, Velshore said, their crystalline voice carrying a note of concern. Possibly Category 6 based on the cloud density and rotation speed. Our habitats can withstand Category 4 storms, one of the Vrexian engineers stated. Category 5 would be concerning, but manageable with proper precautions. We should secure all external equipment and seal the secondary airlocks as a precaution. The other scientists nodded in agreement. This was concerning but not catastrophic. They had prepared for severe weather scenarios during the mission planning. Sarah Chun had been sitting quietly at the back of the gathering, studying the satellite imagery on her personal datapad. Now she stood and walked to the main display. May I? She asked, gesturing to the controls. Vexler waved his permission. Curious what the human would add to the discussion, Chen pulled up geological survey data alongside the storm imagery. Has anyone looked at the historical weather patterns for Carvex Prime? She asked the assembled scientists. The room fell silent. They'd been on the planet for less than 2 months. Historical data was limited to brief surveys conducted over the past decade. The planet hasn't been studied long enough to establish meaningful historical patterns, Velshore admitted. We have seasonal data covering only 3 local years. Chen nodded as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. She enhanced the geological imagery, focusing on the Western Hemisphere. Look at these erosion patterns, she said, highlighting vast areas where the terrain had been scoured down to bedrock. These canyon systems, these abraded plains, this isn't normal wind erosion. She pulled up cross-sectional analysis of the rock layers, based on sediment dating. These erosion events are periodic. They occur roughly every 30 to 40 standard years, give or take. The implications settled over the room like a cold blanket. You're suggesting this is more than a storm, Vexler said slowly. I'm suggesting this planet has hyperstorms. Chun replied, extreme weather events that make Category 5 look like a spring breeze. She gestured to the Vosges satellite image. This is just the beginning. Whatever's coming has enough force to carve canyons through solid rock. The Vrexian engineers immediately began protesting. Their habitats were built to galactic standard specifications. The materials were tested and certified. The designs had been used successfully on dozens of hostile worlds. With respect, Dr. Chun, one engineer said stiffly, your concerns seem based on speculation. We have concrete engineering data supporting our structures. Integrity. Chun looked at them with an expression that might have been pity. I hope you're right, she said simply. But I've reviewed the specs for your domes. And the Cathari habitats, they're designed for known conditions. Extrapolated from standard weather models, she pointed to the scoured western hemisphere. This planet doesn't have standard weather. Velshore examined geological data more carefully. The Cathari meteorologist's crystalline structure flickered with colors that indicated deep thought. If Dr. Chun's hypothesis is correct, we should evacuate to orbit immediately, Velshore said. The shuttle can be prepped within 2 hours. Vexlar considered this evacuation would mean abandoning months of research, expensive equipment, and potentially their entire base. It would also mean admitting to the Galactic Science Council that they'd established an expedition on a planet without proper environmental analysis. His career would survive the embarrassment, but it wouldn't be pleasant. Let's not be hasty, the commander said. We'll continue monitoring the storm. If it shows signs of exceeding our safety margins, we'll evacuate, but I won't abandon this expedition based on hypothesis and ancient erosion patterns. Chun closed her datapad. How long until the storm reaches our position? She asked. Vosherev Cathari consulted the atmospheric models. Approximately 18 hours at current speed, they replied, though the storm appears to be accelerating. Then we have time to prepare, Dexler declared. Secure all equipment, seal the habitats, and prepare the shuttle for possible emergency launch. We'll ride this out and continue our work once it passes. The meeting adjourned with scientists hurrying to their tasks. Chun remained behind for a moment, watching the storm data update in real time. Dexler approached her as the dome emptied. You think we're making a mistake, he observed. I think you're trusting specifications over observation, Chun replied. And I think this planet is about to teach you the difference. And what will you do? The commander asked. My bunker has capacity for 20 people, Chun said. It's stocked with supplies for 30 days, has redundant life support, and is designed to withstand pretty much anything nature can throw at it. She looked directly at Dexlar. First come, first served. Commander, I recommend you bring your people when your domes start failing. With that, she left the communal area and headed toward her shelter. Dexlar watched her go, irritated by her presumption but also unsettled by her confidence. The human had been right about several geological predictions during the expedition. Her analysis had led them to discover 2 of the underground water reserves, but this seemed like paranoia taken to an extreme. Still, as he returned to coordinating the storm preparations, Dexler found himself making a mental note of which supplies would be essential in an emergency evacuation just in case. The human's insurance policy became necessary by evening. The sky had begun to change. The usual rust-orange hue was shifting toward a deeper red. Like old blood, the wind, normally a gentle breeze, was picking up strength. Velcher's instruments showed the storm was indeed accelerating, now moving at nearly 250 kilometers per hour, and it was growing. The spiral now covered nearly a third of the planet's surface inside her bunker. Sarah Chun ran final systems checks: air filtration, operational water recycling, operational backup, Power. Fully charged emergency. Medical supplies. Stocked and inventoried food rations. Enough for 20 people for 40 days. Structural integrity. All seals holding. Reinforcement struts showing green across the board. She stood at the entrance hatch, looking out across the desert toward the research compound. The lights of the domes and crystalline habitats glowed in the gathering darkness. Beautiful, sophisticated, and utterly inadequate for what was coming. Chun descended into her bunker and began the pre-storm lockdown procedures, but she left the main hatch. Unsealed. The storm would arrive in less than 18 hours. She suspected her neighbors would need shelter long before then. The sky turned the color of rust and dry blood as the 16th hour approached since Velshor's initial warning. What had started as subtle atmospheric changes had progressed into something that made even the most confident researchers nervous. The wind arrived gradually, building from a whisper to a moan to a howl that made the habitat structures vibrate in frequencies that set everyone's teeth on edge inside the main Rexian dome. Commander Dexlar monitored the incoming data with growing concern. Velshor's latest readings showed wind speeds already exceeding 300 kilometers per hour, and the main storm front was still 2 hours away from their position. The Cathari meteorologist had stopped trying to classify the storm using standard categories. The measurements are beyond our scale, Velshor reported, their crystalline body flickering with anxious colors. I'm reading sustained winds of 350 kilometers per hour, with gusts approaching 400. The dome specifications rate us for 400-kilometer winds. The Vrexian chief engineer interjected, "We have safety margin," as if in response to this declaration. The dome shuddered. Low groan echoed through the structure as the support frame flexed under the increasing wind pressure outside the transparent walls. The desert had come alive. Sand moved in rivers and waves, flowing across the landscape like liquid. Visibility had dropped to nearly zero as the air filled with particles in the Cathari habitat 300 meters away. Velshor's colleagues were discovering a critical flaw in their elegant crystalline architecture. The first hairline fracture appeared in the southern wall, then another, then a dozen more, spreading like lightning across the faceted surface. The Cathari had designed their structures to be flexible, able to bend and distribute stress across the molecular lattice, but flexibility had limits, and the wind was exceeding those limits. "We need to evacuate to the main dome," one of the Cathari researchers announced. "The structural integrity is failing." The evacuation happened quickly, with the Cathari scientists gathering their most essential equipment and making the dangerous dash across the open ground to the Vrexian habitat. Wind was strong enough to knock even the heaviest researchers off their feet. Safety lines and powered exoskeletons were the only things that got them across as the last Cathari scientist entered the main dome. Dexlar made the call he'd been dreading. "Prepare the shuttle for emergency evacuation," he ordered. "All personnel will evacuate to orbit within the hour." The pilot, a young Vrexian named Sekler, checked the launch parameters and went very still. "Commander, I cannot recommend launch in these conditions," Sekler reported. "The wind shear between ground level and upper atmosphere would tear the ship apart before we reach stable orbit." Dexlar felt his stomach drop. "What are you saying?" he demanded. "I'm saying we're grounded, sir," the pilot replied. "Launch is impossible until the storm passes." The commander looked around the dome at the 43 researchers now depending on him for leadership. Some were colleagues he'd worked with for years, others were young scientists on their first major expedition. All of them were looking at him with various expressions of fear and trust. He made a decision. "We seal the habitat and ride it out," Dexlar announced. "The dome is rated for these conditions. We have supplies, power, and a solid structure. Will be uncomfortable, but we'll survive for another 15 minutes. This plan seemed viable. The dome groaned and flexed, but it held. The researchers secured equipment and moved to the central areas away from the exterior, while some tried to maintain their scientific detachment, taking readings and documenting the storm. Others huddled together in species groups, seeking comfort in familiar company. Then the first seal failed. It started as a hiss, almost inaudible over the howling. When one of the environmental engineers noticed the pressure reading dropping and traced the leak to a seal joint where the dome wall met the foundation. "We have a breach in Sector 7, the engineer reported. "Minor but growing." 2 more engineers rushed to repair the seal while the wind outside reached a sustained velocity of 450 kilometers per hour. The temporary patch held for approximately 3 minutes. Then it blew out, and the emergency klaxons began wailing. "All personnel, evacuate to secondary dome." Dexler shouted over the alarm, but even as he gave the order, he saw through the transparent walls that the secondary dome was already failing. Its entire northern section was peeling away like skin, the reinforced materials tearing like paper. In the wind, Sarah Chun's bunker sat 200 meters away, barely visible through the sand-choked arid. Looked like nothing more than a rocky outcropping, a low stone structure that seemed insignificant compared to the sophisticated habitats, but it was intact. Thexler grabbed the emergency communication system. "All personnel, abandon habitat and proceed to Dr. Chun's shelter immediately," he ordered. "This is not a drill." The evacuation was chaos. Researchers grabbed emergency packs and whatever supplies they could carry. The Delthani xenobiologist tried to save his specimen collection before being physically dragged toward the exit by his colleagues. The main airlock wouldn't open at first. The pressure differential too great. It took 3 engineers working together to manually override the system the moment the airlock opened. The wind nearly sucked them all out. The researchers clipped themselves to safety lines and began the desperate journey across the 200 meters of open desert. The wind was a physical presence, a screaming monster that wanted to tear them apart. D'Arville Shore, being crystalline and therefore having different mass distribution than organic beings, nearly flew away before 2 Vrexian researchers grabbed them. The larger species tried to shield the smaller ones, forming chains of bodies fighting their way through the sandstorm behind them. The main dome's structural frame began to fail. Support struts snapped with sounds like gunshots. The transparent walls started to crack and shatter behind them. The Cathari habitat that had been abandoned earlier simply exploded. The crystalline structure, stressed beyond its breaking point, shattered into millions of fragments that the wind carried away like glittering. Thus Sarah Chun stood at her bunker's entrance hatch, which was set at an angle into the ground. The hatch itself was massive, easily 2 meters across and half a meter thick, designed like something from a submarine or spacecraft. Already opened it and secured it in place. Now she stood anchored by safety lines, wearing a full environmental suit with respirator, manually helping researchers through the entrance. The wind threatened to tear her loose with every gust, but the human held firm. "Move, move," she shouted. Though the wind tore the words away, she grabbed researchers one by one as they reached the hatch, physically hauling them through the entrance. The Delthani with his specimen case, a Vrexian engineer carrying emergency power cells. D'Arville Shore, their crystalline body covered in impact scratches from windborne debris. Commander Dexler came last, making sure every member of his expedition had made it ahead of him. As he tumbled through the hatch, he looked back to see the main dome's catastrophic failure. The entire structure lifted off its foundation and tumbled away into the maelstrom like a child's toy equipment. Research data, months of work all gone in seconds. Chun didn't wait for him to process the loss. The moment Dexler was through, she began cycling the hatch, closed it, Took all her strength to turn the wheel lock against the wind pressure when it finally sealed with a heavy clang. The roar of the storm became muffled, distant for a moment. 43 beings of various species stood dripping sand and shaking in the cramped entrance chamber. The temperature was controlled. The air was clean, and the walls were solid. They were. Alive. Chum removed her respirator and looked at the assembled researchers. "Welcome to my insurance policy," she said. "There are secondary airlocks ahead. Follow me and watch your heads. I built this for functionality, not comfort." She led them deeper into the bunker, through 2 more airlocks that sealed behind them, each seal closed with solid mechanical precision, cutting off more of the storm's fury when they finally reached the main living area. Even Dexler had to admit a grudging respect for what the human had built. The bunker was larger than it appeared from outside, with multiple chambers radiating from a central hub. The walls were rough stone reinforced with hull plating. The ceiling was low, forcing the tall Avrexians to stoop slightly, but everywhere there were signs of careful planning. Water recyclers hummed quietly in one corner. Air filtration systems processed the dusty air with steady efficiency. A small hydroponic garden grew under LED lights, providing both food and oxygen generation. Emergency supplies were stacked in organized rows. Medical equipment waited in a dedicated chamber. Even a small recreation area with basic entertainment and exercise equipment. Everything was overbuilt, redundant, designed to keep working when everything else failed. "There are sleeping quarters in the back chambers," Chun explained. "Sanitation facilities are here." She indicated a door. "Water is rationed, but sufficient food stores will last us 30 days. Minimum if we're careful." She pulled up a display showing external sensors. "The storm is going to get worse before it gets better. We're looking at sustained winds over 800 kilometers per hour within the next few hours." The researchers stared at the numbers in horror. 800 kilometers per hour was beyond anything in their experience. "How long?" Velshore asked quietly. The first 12 hours in the bunker were the hardest. The researchers were crammed into a space designed for emergency occupation rather than comfort. Species with different environmental preferences had to compromise on temperature and humidity settings. The low ceilings made the tall Avrexians uncomfortable. Recycled air smelled faintly of stone dust and growing plants, but they were alive. And as the storm's fury grew above them, that fact became increasingly precious. Sarah Chun had divided the main living area into functional zones. The sleeping quarters occupied the back chambers, with basic bunks stacked too high. The central hub served as a common area, medical station, and monitoring center. The hydroponic garden and water recycling systems had their own dedicated space. Everything was labeled clearly in multiple languages. Dr. Velshore had immediately claimed one of the monitoring stations and connected their instruments to Chun's external sensors. Data coming in was almost incomprehensible. Wind speed has reached 650 kilometers per hour, the Cathari reported during the first evening gathering. Atmospheric pressure variations are creating shock waves. The temperature outside has dropped 30 degrees due to the dust density blocking solar radiation. Through Chun's external cameras, mounted in reinforced housings, they watched their world being destroyed. The Rexian domes that had seemed so permanent were gone, leaving only foundation anchors embedded in bedrock. The Cathari habitat had been reduced to scattered crystalline fragments that tumbled past the cameras like deadly snowflakes. The deadly snowflakes that research station shuttle appeared briefly in one camera view, tumbling end over end across the desert, before disappearing into the rust-colored Fury equipment worth millions of credits was scattered. Across kilometers, delicate scientific instruments were being sandblasted into scrap metal. Months of research Data stored in physical samples was irretrievably lost, Commander. Dexler stood watching the feeds with an expression of stunned grief. His expedition, his responsibility, his career, all being torn apart by forces beyond any control. Chung appeared beside him, holding 2 containers of hot synthetic coffee. I know it's not much, but the stimulant helps, she offered. Thanks. Lur accepted the container automatically. Everything is gone, he said quietly. My entire research station, all our work. The council will have my credentials for this. You're alive, Chun replied. Your entire team is alive. That's what matters. But the cost is nothing compared to the alternative. The human. Interrupted. Credits can be replaced, equipment can be rebuilt, data can be gathered. Again, people can't be brought back. She gestured around the bunker at the researchers huddled in small groups. You got everyone out. You made the right call when it counted. That's what leadership actually means over the following hours and days. The expedition members began to settle into an uneasy routine. Chun had anticipated the psychological challenges of confinement and had prepared accordingly. The recreation area, though small, included games, puzzles, and entertainment media from multiple cultures. The exercise equipment allowed for physical activity in the confined space. The work schedules she implemented gave everyone tasks that kept minds occupied. Rexian engineers studied the bunker systems with growing appreciation. Every component had redundancy. The air filtration had 3 separate systems, each capable of supporting the full occupancy alone. The Dua water recycling could process even contaminated sand water in emergencies. Power systems included solar collectors that would activate when the storm cleared, battery reserves, and even a manual generation option. It's like she prepared for every possible failure. One engineer marveled, because I did. Chun replied when this observation was shared with her. Systems fail. It's not pessimism. It's reality, so you design for failure and build in recovery options. Dr. Velshore spent hours analyzing the storm data and comparing it with Chun's geological surveys. The Kathari meteorologists began to understand the pattern. These hyperstorms are planetary climate events. Velshore explained during a group briefing on the second day. They occur when specific atmospheric conditions align with the planet's elliptical orbit. Approximately every 35 years, Carvex Prime passes through a region of its orbit where solar radiation triggers massive convection events. The meteorologists projected historical sediment analysis. Dr. Chung's geological surveys showed evidence of these events. Going back millions of years, the Western Hemisphere is more severely eroded because it faces the prevailing direction of the storm system. Our research station was in a relatively sheltered zone, which is why some geological features still exist here. How did we miss this during the initial surveys? Dexler asked. The initial surveys were conducted during the calm period between storms. Chun answered. Your advanced team did basic atmospheric and geological scans, found the planet scientifically interesting, and established the expedition. Weren't looking for evidence of catastrophic weather because you had no reason to suspect it existed. She pulled up the original survey data. It's right here in the erosion patterns. The sediment layers, the lack of substantial surface features, but you have to know what you're looking for. Earth as humans to always ask, what's the worst thing nature has done to this place, and when will it do it again? The question prompted discussions about Earth and human approaches to survival. The researchers had worked with humans before, but had never really understood the species. Unusual focus on worst-case scenarios on Earth. Chen explained during a meal period. We faced ice ages that covered continents, volcanic eruptions that darkened the sky for years, asteroid impacts, floods, droughts, pandemics, and disasters we still don't fully understand from the geological record. She gestured around the bunker. This isn't paranoia, it's inherited wisdom from a million generations of ancestors. who survived when preparation meant the difference between extinction and continuation. A young Delthani researcher asked the question many were thinking, but doesn't it make you afraid? Living with constant awareness of potential disasters. Chun considered this. It makes me realistic. She said, I know that nature is powerful, unpredictable, and completely indifferent to our survival. But I also know that preparation, planning, and community can overcome almost any challenge. She smiled slightly. Fear is useful when it motivates. Action becomes a problem when it causes paralysis. I'm not afraid of the storm because I prepared for it. The question isn't, what if something goes wrong? But rather, when something goes wrong. What's my plan? By the third day, the storm above them had reached its peak intensity. Welcher's instruments recorded sustained wind speeds exceeding 800 kilometers per hour. The atmospheric pressure had dropped so severely that exposed water would boil at room temperature. The temperature outside had plunged to minus 40 degrees. The noise was constant. A deep bass rumbled that vibrated through the bedrock itself. But inside the bunker, life continued. Researchers shared stories from their home worlds. Cathari demonstrated their meditation techniques, which several others found helpful for managing anxiety. The Vrexians organized educational sessions on engineering principles. Delthani taught xenobiology lessons using Earth ecology as an example. Chun maintained the systems, rationed supplies with careful precision, and monitored everyone's physical and mental health. She proved to be not just a skilled engineer, but also an effective leader in crisis when conflicts arose over resource allocation or personal space. She mediated with practical fairness when someone showed signs of acute stress. She had protocols for intervention and support. You've done this before, Wexler observed during a quiet moment in the monitoring station. Not exactly this, Chun replied, but similar situations, disasters don't all look the same. But human responses to them follow patterns. Keep people fed, occupied, and informed, maintain routines to provide psychological anchors, address problems before they escalate, create hope without making false promises. She checked the external readings. The storm is beginning to weaken. Peak intensity past about 4 hours ago. Looking at another 24 to 30 hours before it's safe to open the hatches. The commander studied the human with new appreciation. I owe you an apology, he said. When you arrived with your construction materials, I thought you were primitive, paranoid, unable to trust in proper engineering. You weren't entirely wrong, Chun admitted. I don't trust engineering without redundancy. I don't trust specifications without real-world testing, and I definitely don't trust that I've imagined every possible failure mode. She gestured at her bunker. This isn't about superior technology or better materials. It's about accepting that you can't predict everything. So you over-prepare for anything. As the fourth day arrived and the storm finally began to abate, the researchers gathered to watch through the external cameras. The wind was dropping. Now only 300 kilometers per hour visibility was improving. As the dust began to settle, the landscape that emerged was transformed where their research station had stood. Only scoured bedrock remained. Dunes had shifted by kilometers. Rock formations they'd been studying were gone, either eroded away or buried under new sand deposits. But Chun's bunker had survived. External sensors showed minor surface damage, some erosion of the exposed stone, but the structure remained sound. The storm passed completely on the morning of the fifth day, leaving behind a world transformed and scoured clean. Sarah Chun ran final atmospheric checks before beginning the process of unsealing the bunker outside. Air pressure had normalized. Wind had dropped to gentle breezes. Temperature was rising as solar radiation once again reached the surface. It was safe to emerge. The researchers gathered in the entrance chamber as Chun operated the manual override for the main hatch. The wheel lock turned with mechanical precision. each revolution bringing them closer to seeing what remained of their expedition when the hatch finally swung open. Natural light flooded the entrance for the first time in days. The researchers climbed out one by one, stepping onto a landscape that bore little resemblance to the world they'd known. Rust-colored deserts stretched to the horizon. But everything had changed. Dunes had migrated kilometers from their previous positions. Rock formations that had stood for millennia were gone, eroded to stumps or buried completely. The research station's location was marked only by foundation anchors and the occasional piece of equipment too heavy or too deeply buried for the wind to move. Commander Dexler stood where the main dome had been, looking at the empty mounting points where his research station had stood. 43 people had lived and worked here just days ago. Now, there was only bare rock and settling dust. "It's all gone," whispered one of the young Rexian researchers. "Not all of it," Chum said quietly. Emerged last, carrying equipment to set up a communication beacon. "The data we collected, the discoveries we made, the research, most of it was uploaded to the orbital servers during regular updates. You lost the physical samples and some recent work, but the core scientific findings are safe." Dexler turned to look at her. "I meant as a reprimand," he said. "Everything I built is gone. The council will ask why I didn't evacuate sooner, why I didn't recognize the threat, why I lost millions of credits worth of equipment. And you'll tell them that you encountered a previously uncharacterized planetary phenomenon, that you made decisions based on the best available data, and that you successfully preserved the most valuable resource of all." Chun replied. She gestured at the assembled researchers. 43 lives saved, 0 casualties. That's not failure, Commander, that's exceptional crisis management. Dr. Velshore was already setting up portable weather monitoring equipment, unable to resist gathering data even in the aftermath of disaster. The atmospheric conditions are remarkably stable now, the Cathari reported. It's as if the hyperstorm reset the entire planetary weather system. Fascinating. The researchers began to spread out, salvaging what they could from the debris field. Occasionally, someone would find an intact piece of equipment or a sealed container that had survived the storm. Each discovery was greeted with small celebrations over the following hours. Chum helped coordinate the salvage efforts and set up temporary shelter using materials from her bunker's storage. The emergency beacon she deployed was already transmitting, signaling any ships in the system that survivors were present and required evacuation. The response came faster than expected. A commercial transport that had been 3 days out from Carvex Prime picked up the beacon and diverted to provide assistance. They would arrive within 4 days. Until then, the expedition would camp in at around Chun's bunker, which suddenly seemed less like paranoid over-engineering and more like the most sensible structure any of them had ever seen. On the second day after the storm, Dexler found Chun standing beside her bunker, surveying the scoured landscape. "I wanted to speak with you privately," the commander said. "I've been thinking about what happened, about the decisions I made. You're wondering if you should have listened to me sooner." Chum said it wasn't a question. "I'm wondering if my arrogance killed 43 people." Dexler replied bluntly, "It didn't." Chum said firmly, "You made reasonable decisions based on the information you had. Your equipment was rated for severe conditions. Your engineers knew their specifications. You had no reason to believe those specifications were inadequate." She turned to look at him directly. "The difference between us wasn't intelligence or competence, it was experience. My species has survived everything our homeworld could throw at us, and it taught us to never trust specifications over observation." "Still," Dexler insisted, "I should have taken your warnings more seriously." "Maybe," Chun acknowledged, "but you also got everyone out when it mattered. You prioritized lives over equipment and pride. That's leadership. They stood in silence for a moment, watching as Velshore and several other researchers documented the geological changes the storm had created. "What will you do now?" Vexler asked, "When we're evacuated." Chun smiled slightly. "I'm going to file a comprehensive report on Carvex Prime's hyperstorm cyclone, going to recommend that this planet be reclassified as extreme hazard for surface operations, and then I'm going to design better emergency shelter protocols for planetary expeditions." She patted the bunker's wall. Affectionately, this worked. But it could be better, more comfortable, more efficient. Easier to deploy if we're going to keep exploring hostile worlds. "We need to prepare for their hostility," the commander nodded. "I'll be recommending you for a commendation. You saved this expedition. I built a hole in the ground." Chun replied, "You made the hard calls that got people into that hole. We both did our jobs." Over the next 2 days, as the expedition waited for rescue, something shifted in the dynamic between the human and her colleagues, researchers who had barely acknowledged Chun before now sought her advice on emergency preparedness. The Rexian engineers studied every aspect of the bunker, taking notes and asking detailed questions about design. Philosophy. The Cathari scientists collaborated with Chun on analyzing how the hyperstorm had affected the planet's ecology and geology. Vexler compiled reports for the Galactic Science Council, and he made sure Chun's contributions were prominently featured, not just her bunker, but her geological analysis, her early warnings, her leadership during the crisis when the rescue ship finally arrived. Its crew was amazed to find the entire expedition alive and in relatively good condition. The ship's captain, an elderly Delthani with decades of experience, listened to the storm report with wide eyes. 800 kilometers per hour sustained winds? The captain repeated. "And you survived in a basic shelter?" "Not basic," Vexler corrected. "Exceptionally well-engineered. Chun designed it specifically for worst-case scenarios." As the researchers packed their salvaged equipment and prepared to evacuate, many took time to walk through Chun's bunker one last time. The rough stone walls, the cramped chambers, the over-designed systems that had seemed excessive before the storm. Now they understood this wasn't paranoia or primitive thinking. This was wisdom earned through millennia of surviving on a world that had tried every possible way to kill the species that evolved thereon. The final evening before departure, the expedition held an informal gathering outside the bunker. Someone had salvaged enough food supplies to create a modest meal. They sat in a circle on the scoured bedrock, 43 beings of different species, sharing stories and processing their shared trauma. "I had a question," one of the younger researchers said, addressing Chun. "Why did you share your shelter with us? You could have sealed yourself inside and been perfectly safe alone." The human looked surprised by the question. "Because that's what you do," she said simply. "When disaster comes, you help people. You share resources, you work together to survive." She gestured at the group. On Earth, humans learned early that we're stronger together. One person might survive alone, but a community thrives. I built the bunker big enough for 20 people because I knew that if something went wrong, I'd want to help, not hide. "Even though we mocked you?" another researcher asked. "Even though we called your preparations primitive and paranoid?" Chun shrugged. "You weren't trying to be cruel. You genuinely believed your technology was adequate. And honestly, under normal conditions, it would have been this planet just had abnormal conditions." She smiled. "Besides, being right means nothing if you can't help people. What's the point of preparing for disaster if you're not willing to share that preparation when disaster comes?" Commander Vexler raised his container of water in a toast. To Dr. Sarah Chun, he announced, "Who taught us that the best technology isn't always the most advanced, but the most reliable?" "To survival," Chun countered. and to learning from our mistakes. To survival, the group echoed. The next morning, the evacuation proceeded smoothly. These researchers boarded the rescue ship with their salvaged equipment and irreplaceable data. The ship's crew marveled at the bunker. Taking extensive scans and documentation, Chun was the last aboard. Pausing at the hatch to look back at her creation, the bunker sat low against the scoured landscape, looking like it belonged there, like it had always been there and would remain long after they'd all departed 6 months later. Sarah Chun returned to Carvex Prime. This time she came with a new expedition, properly equipped and educated about the planet's hyperstorm cycle. The research proposal had been fast-tracked after Dexler's detailed reports reached the Galactic Science Council. The bunker was still there, exactly as she'd left it, weathered, sly,